Trustees. I'm from Henderson, Franklin. I'm an attorney. I practice intellectual property. And we're here with another one of our installments in the Lunch and Learn series. And today, Ed Canterbury is going to be talking about commercial leasing and what startups need to look for in terms of entering their first commercial lease. So I'm going to hand the floor over to Ed, and thank you.
Thanks, Mark. So yeah, as Mark mentioned, I'm a real estate attorney. Been practicing for about 11.5 years, board certified in real estate law. A lot of my practice is commercial based, whether it's development, leasing, financing, building, those types of things. So what we're really trying to do here is focus on what a new business or startup would be interested in, certain minefields within the leasing context of things to look out for when negotiating your first lease and things to think about. I guess one thing to point out is, as far as like price per square foot, those kinds of things, like you were mentioning earlier, Raul, I mean, that's not necessarily what you would come to a real estate attorney for. It is, we see a lot of what is kind of within the realm of reasonable, as far as I'm not paying too much, but as far as whether or not the actual price per square foot of that is in line. You want to work with a broker or real estate broker or agent. So what I've done is kind of put together a couple of tips. The first one, it might seem kind of obvious, but in Florida, if it's going to be longer than 1 year, it has to be in writing. And we get a lot of calls, you'd be surprised, where people, they feel comfortable with that landlord and they say, well, we never really actually had a lease, I just kind of moved in, here was the deal, we have some emails back and forth or whatever it is. So the first suggestion, although it seems basic, is it should be in writing, and it also should be witnessed by two disinterested witnesses. And the way this sort of comes up and becomes important is you'll get either sort of landlord remorse or tenant remorse, where maybe you sign a lease and then you start going through steps, lining up vendors, contractors and those kinds of things, only to find out the landlord might have gotten a better deal somewhere else. The landlord might try to argue that because it wasn't witnessed, there's no lease. Sorry, but you have no rights. So it should be witnessed. It should be in writing. That's sort of a basic protection. There are some defenses as far as like substantial reliance and those kinds of things. So if one party went out and incurred expenses in reliance on that lease, or actually moved into the space and started doing some repairs or some improvements before the actual lease commenced, that's where you can get into those sort of arguments. But for the most part, you just want to make sure that's the way it is. Most spaces are not move-in ready. Some of them are, but more often than not, you're going to find that you either need to do some work, and either you're going to do it or the landlord is going to do it, whether it's knocking out a wall or adding a wall to reduce the size of the space, those types of things. So that's general category is tenant improvements. And what's important when memorializing the lease on the improvements is to define the work that's going to be done and who's going to do it and who's going to pay for it. Those basic things. But there are ways of defining who's going to develop the plan, whether the tenant's going to hire a contractor or an architect, and submit those plans to the landlord or vice versa. And then there's going to be a period where the parties are going to negotiate those plans. Once they're approved, also usually there's a budget involved in those plans. So that back and forth needs to be addressed in the lease as far as who's going to do it and who's going to pay for it and those kinds of things. Usually the tenant will try to look for some sort of contribution. And I'm pausing here because for some reason the slide is moving on the computer but
batteries, maybe the battery on the remote.
I don't know, it's moving,
Oh, it's moving there, but not, oh yeah.
but not there.
It's funny.
But I think we can,
Yeah,
since
we
there's
can-
only a few of
We
us,
can do that.
we'll improvise.
Yeah.
And this is, so with the contribution, if you're moving in as the tenant and you want the landlord to contribute to the cost, because it might be that your lease is a 5-year lease and the improvements that you're doing are gonna benefit the property after you move out. So the landlord may be willing to kick in, either pay for the build out entirely, and if so, that's usually baked into, you'll end up paying a little bit higher rent because of that, or the tenant may agree to pay for it, and the landlord may agree to contribute some of that. So one of the things to think about is whether the tenant, if they are getting money from the landlord, is the landlord going to pay that money directly to the contractor, or are they going to pay it as a reimbursement to the tenant? And that's just important from a cash flow standpoint. If you're the tenant, the more you have to pay up front and then get reimbursement from the landlord. It's just an economic consideration to keep in mind how those dollars are going to flow. Usually if you're putting in substantial monies into a build out, there's always the risk of, in Florida certainly, hurricane damage, fire damage, those kinds of things. And the way that works is usually there's insurance in place, either from the landlord or the tenant, or a combination of the two, that would insure those improvements. But from the tenant standpoint, if the lease says that the lease terminates upon a certain casualty event, and the insurance proceeds for those build-out improvements get paid to the landlord, then the tenant could potentially be out, the lease could be terminated, and the insurance proceeds go to the landlord, not the tenant. Now the tenant might be, if they've invested $100,000 or whatever it is into the build-out, they may not be able to receive the benefit of that. So it's important in the lease, not only defining what the repair obligations are following a casualty event, but also who's the lost payee on the insurance proceeds, because it could end up being a windfall or a loss for one party.
Good question, because I've been shopping around. There's a lot of creativity when it comes to those who pays and when section you talked about, including rent deduction. Does that have to be a word of mouth? It has to be by law on the lease agreement.
The rent reduction in the event the space is unusable.
In the event that the tenant, the tenant, do repairs on the place I'm moving in.
Oh, so you're not paying rent while you're building out the space?
Exactly.
Yes, that would be, as part of your lease, you would want to have, there's usually, or not usually, but there can be a commencement date of the lease.
Right.
And then a rent commencement date. So the lease may start January 1st, but your rent doesn't start until March 1st. So in that scenario, you would have 2 full months to build out the space, do your improvements. Most businesses aren't, just like the spaces aren't moving ready,
Right.
You're not going to be ready to start making money in the space, usually the day, unless it's perfectly ready the way you want it. You don't want to pay rent while there's no income from your business. So there's a lot of back and forth there on how long you need to complete the build out before the rent actually kicks in. If that answers your question.
Yep.
I don't handle a lot of eviction, landlord-tenant litigation, but some of my partners do. I just wanted to touch on a couple of things just so you're understanding what can go wrong with a lease and what the typical consequences can be for that. The normal or the default rule under the statute is that for a monetary default, such as failure to pay rent or utilities or CAM costs, it's a 3-day notice and cure period, and then a non-monetary default, like failure to maintain premises, those kinds of things, to the extent the tenant's required to do that, would be a 15-day default. So in your lease as a tenant, you certainly want to build in, you can build in more than this, and I recommend that you do, maybe a 10-day notice and cure period for a monetary default. And for a non-monetary default, usually either 15 to 30 days, but then if it's the type of cure that cannot be completed within that time period, then you're going to have some language that would extend it, you know, and as long as you're reasonably seeking the cure. Other things that can help, you know, we get calls from landlords who say the tenant's defaulted, we just want to go in there, change the locks, and take all their inventory. There is no self-help in Florida. You cannot go in and just change the locks, so you have to go through the typical eviction process, which unfortunately, and much to the landlord's chagrin, is not always as quick as you might think. So tenants from that standpoint do sort of can get the benefit of the doubt in that scenario. Unfortunately, just by the slow nature of the judicial system is that you may be in there and not paying rent, and it takes a while for the landlord to actually recover the space. It's just a risk of doing business, really, if you're a landlord. Accelerating rent, that's one thing where if it's not in the lease, it's not permitted. So as a tenant, you wouldn't want that in there, but it's very tough to find a landlord who's willing to agree to that. And what that means is that if you have a 10-year lease and you breach the lease in year 3, they can accelerate the rent so that you would owe the entire rent for the remaining 7 years on the lease. That is going to be offset against sort of the, you know, if they're able to relet the space or they have to use reasonable efforts to mitigate their damages, those things all come into play, but they would be able to at least seek a judgment for the entire amount of the remaining rent under the lease. Tenant inventory and those kinds of things, there is a landlord lien on inventory that attaches when it's brought to the space, something to be aware of. And then the other thing I wanted to touch on was a lease guarantee. Usually for a new startup where there's not a lot of credit history out there with respect to that business, the landlord is going to want some sort of credit-worthy individual to sign a personal guarantee. Meaning that if the business is not performing or paying the rent, they can then have a claim against that person individually, go against their individual assets, those kinds of things. And then, you know, from a tenant remedy standpoint, usually the biggest complaint from tenants is, well, I'm not paying my rent because the landlord's not maintaining the HVAC like they're supposed to, or the landlord's not maintaining the property. So there is some statutory default language in there, but typically that can be circumvented in the actual lease document. So it's not unheard of that the landlord may not be able to pay their mortgage. Maybe the tenants, maybe they have a shopping center and the tenants aren't doing well. They're not able to service the loan, and in a foreclosure scenario, what happens is the lender can come in, and if they acquire the property at foreclosure, they're essentially the new landlord. And if that lease is entered into after the mortgage, that lease is subordinate to the mortgage. So the lender could technically wipe out the lease if they wanted to. If you're investing money into the space, like a build out, those kinds of things, you would want to consider what's called an SNDA. It's a subordination, non-disturbance, and internment agreement. And what that'll do is it'll basically say that the tenant gets to stay in the space and not lose the investment of their build out, so long as they continue to pay rent, regardless of whether the landlord is.
So in more common terms, I rent with this guy. This guy defaults, if it's foreclosed, the new owner can demand the rent from me, just like the old, with the old, using the old lease agreement with the old owner?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
It essentially runs with the property, so.
Okay.
Another thing you might want to consider is with a startup company is your competition and how you want to try to protect against your competitors being either in your same space, or if your landlord rents or owns a lot of property in the area, you don't want to see your competitor in the building next door. So it's this idea of exclusive uses. So, if you want to be the only IT or IT repair guy in town or in the strip center, and the landlord may want to limit that. Just they don't want 6 of the same business in the same center. It's not good for traffic and that sort of thing. But you might want to consider, as long as I have in here, you can't rent to anybody else who does these types of things. So it's called an exclusive use. You might also say, again, if your landlord owns other properties, you might say that to the extent the landlord owns any property within a 10-mile radius or whatever it is, that they will not rent to a similar business as yours. There's also, if you're in a shopping center, there might be existing exclusives that are already in favor of other tenants. You have to be careful of those also. So maybe some guy is already in the IT business. Maybe he has an exclusive and the landlord either forgot about it, or maybe it's a new landlord and they didn't pay attention as much in the new lease. And by leasing to you, they'd be violating that other tenant's exclusive, which could end up being a problem for you. So usually you just want some sort of representation or warranty from the landlord that what they're able to enter into your lease and that it's not violating any exclusives. With respect to renewal options, usually for startup companies, you wouldn't recommend a very long lease term. Instead of doing a 10-year lease, maybe it's better you have a 3-year lease and you have options to renew. Maybe 2 or 3 options to renew an additional 2 or 3 years at a time. Because you just don't know how your business is going to last, what the success pattern is going to be. So really the key is flexibility from a startup standpoint. With the renewal option, so let's say that you're able to negotiate a 3-year lease and 2 or 3 renewal options of 2 or 3 years each. The question is, what happens to the rent at the beginning of that renewal option? Does it just continue to increase at the same rate that the original term increased? Because normally you might see, for your first 3-year term, you might see that rent increases 3% a year. So the first 3 years, you can bank on that annual increase. But then when the renewal option kicks in, if you exercise it, are we just going another 3% over the prior year, or are we resetting to a fair market value type of scenario?
So the lease is the only tool that prevents owner to increase the rent price. Am I right?
It's the only tool that allows the landlord to increase the rent.
But if it's stipulated in the lease that there's no increase in rent, that could be also stipulated?
Yeah, you can stipulate a flat rent for as long as you want, as long as the parties agree to it. That way, your costs are going to be predictable, whether there's an increase or not.
Right.
But you can certainly try to keep it a steady rate for the first term. The landlord might, if their landlord's inclined to agree to that, they might give that to you, but then say, okay, but if you renew, it's going to jump up a little higher than, to make up for that.
For that increase.
For that flat rate, we're going to make up for it if you renew.
Gotcha.
But it's just important to have that spelled out. We see a lot of times where it just says, if they renew, it goes to fair market value. fair market value is a nebulous term. You know, all it means is that the parties are going to potentially argue about it later. And so what you normally see is some sort of appraisal procedure. It's almost like an arbitration clause where if the parties are not able to agree on what the fair market value is at that time, then one party can get an appraisal, they share it with the other. If that party doesn't agree to it, then that party gets an appraisal, and then it becomes sort of a battle of the appraisers. But that's usually the most reasonable way to settle that. Also, for flexibility purposes, you might want an option to purchase the space. You want to sort of test drive the space with your lease, but also have the option, if you decide business is going well or the location really just can't be beat, then you might want to have the option to purchase. We see all sort of iterations of really broad language to the most detailed, and usually you want to be more detailed on this side of it. We recommend attaching a copy of the actual contract to the lease as an exhibit. That way, there's nothing to argue about later on down the road. Everything's pre-negotiated as far as who's paying the closing costs, when the closing's going to be, title insurance, survey, those kinds of things. Maybe even seller financing might be involved in it. But yeah.
I also work as a Rocket Lounge ambassador, so I'm trying to bring businesses from Peru, South America, to come here and open. As a matter of fact, I have a trip to Peru next year, so I can do this kind of conference, So, that option to purchase, are you purchasing the whole plaza or just that little? Can you just select that unit where you are?
It depends on if that unit is its own separate legal property. So if you just have a strip center,
right,
and they're just demising walls,
right,
and they're not condominiumized, then you can't buy each individual unit. But if it's been condominiumized, then you can buy an individual unit without buying the whole building.
What are the characteristics of a condominium?
It's a condominium, just like you would see sort of in a residential standpoint, almost like an apartment, where it's just a formal process where the landlord records a condominium declaration, and under the Florida condominium statute, that legally creates these independent units that can be sold independent of the other.
So potentially any landlord can do a condominium declaration and unionize each unit?
They could, yes.
There's no facility restriction like have to have their own, P.O. box or something like that?
Well, there are technical requirements for the condominium.
Okay.
So not every property is going to qualify for a condominium.
Gotcha.
But if you meet those requirements, then the landlord can condominiumize it, and then they can sell those individual units. So it's one, if you're thinking about an option to purchase when you're going into the lease, it's definitely something you'd want to investigate up front.
Yes.
Because you may find out the property's not capable of being condominiumized, and then your option is pretty useless. Unless you get some sort of option on the whole building. But for startups, that's usually not the focus. Also, sort of in the spirit of flexibility, you may want to expand the space. There's expansion options and contraction options. So as a startup, you may say, I need 1,500 square feet, but it would be nice, if things go the way I think they're going to go in year 3, I probably need an additional 500 square feet. You would want to build that into your lease agreement as an expansion option. And then you'd also want to identify, is the lease just going to expand and everything, like price per square foot, is going to be identical on that new space that it is on the existing space? Or are there improvements in that additional 500 square feet that need to be done if I exercise the option, and if so, again, like we talked about with the tenant improvements, who's gonna pay for them? When are they gonna be done? When does the rent start from those kinds of things? Same thing with the contraction option. You may start out with 1,500 square feet, realize you need half the space for your business, and you would basically have this option to give back space to the landlord. And then same thing, does the rent just reduce proportionately on a square footage basis, or is there some economy of scale where maybe you have to pay a higher per square foot rent on the smaller space that you have? And is there any work that needs to be done to make that smaller space fit your needs? So it can work both ways, but from a flexibility standpoint, these are things you want to think about. Also, to that sort of same theme is an early termination option. You see this more so in retail, but with a retail startup, and in retail, a lot of time rent can be based on your sales volume. So if the tenant's not, you might pay a base rent as a retail tenant, and then you pay a proportion of your sales proceeds on top of what you do. You're basically in a partner almost with the landlord, because the partner is sharing in your profits once you reach a certain level of sales. But with a startup, you may be concerned that you don't know how sales are going to be or how your business is going to do, so you might want an early termination option to say, okay, well, what's my break-even point where I need to move so many units per year, and if I don't, I need to have the right to get out of the lease. And those things can be negotiated and often are negotiated and put into the lease.
Is that a buyout, or is it?
Basically a buyout, yeah. You say, okay, landlord, sorry, 3 years in, it's not working. So, what's the divorce going to cost me at that point? So you negotiate that up front. Try to anyway. It doesn't give some landlords if it's not in a retail standpoint, it may not give the landlord a real warm and fuzzy that they know that you have a termination option, but presumably sophisticated, they can figure out whether that amount of money would make it worth their while to recapture the space.
So it could be a flat fee rather than a remaining months pending.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, because from the landlord's standpoint, they get the space back.
Right.
Maybe it's improved. That's something you have to keep in mind. If you put 40 grand into the build out, if you terminate it after year 3 because maybe you want to try to, so the landlord's going to get the benefit of that new cabinetry you put in or whatever it is, which presumably will help him command a higher rent from a new tenant. So he gets the space back. Landlord can relet it to somebody else. There's no guarantee they're going to find a tenant, and there's no guarantee of what that new tenant's going to pay. But those are all the economic considerations that go into negotiating that buyout.
Interesting.
Also, as a startup, if an early termination option is not available, what are other outs under the lease? Assignment and subleasing are two very common ones. In the assignment context, you're basically finding a replacement tenant, and you're sort of assigning everything onto that new tenant. And the new tenant takes it basically subject to the existing terms of your lease. In a sublease standpoint, and sort of relating back to the expansion and contraction concept, but you may decide you don't need 500 or 1,000 square feet of your space anymore, and you know somebody who does, or you find somebody who does, you can sublease that portion of the space to that new tenant. And then there's sort of a hierarchy where you have the landlord, you have you as the tenant, and then you have the subtenant underneath you. And the subtenant would pay you rent, which in turn offsets the cost of your rent to the landlord. But there's usually restrictions on assigning and subletting in the lease, so as a startup, you would want to try to make those restrictions as weak as possible, or at least give you as much flexibility to try to find a new tenant, whether through an assignment or sublease. Usually the landlord would want to see some sort of net worth or creditworthiness from the new tenant in the context of an assignment, or a sublease for that matter. And then they also look at, well, is this new person you're bringing in good for the tenant mix at the center? You know, they don't want the sublessee or the assignee violating some exclusive that or they just may not want another business. You know, we don't need two IT businesses in here. We need a better tenant mix. So those are things you want to try to keep out of the prohibitions. Those are some of the highlights as far as just trying to maintain flexibility in your lease from a startup standpoint. There's certainly other things that can be discussed, but those are kind of the high level things that I would keep in mind if I were in the startup position. Just making sure that I was at least aware of what these issues are and that you can see how they sort of interplay. So,
Thank you.
if you guys have any questions, happy to answer those. But
I'm sorry, I've been asking all the questions throughout the presentation.
No, sure.
Well, actually, I do, if you don't mind, just briefly. You talked about the real estate law in Florida, the commercial leasing characteristics that should be there. Is that a law, or is that just normal business practice to have two witnesses and all that? What you went down in this presentation? Is that law to be in there, or just?
it is on the witnesses. It is. If
It
it's,
is?
If it's more than a year, it should be in writing and witnessed.
Okay.
A lot of the other stuff that I talked about is more like what can you write into. None of the other stuff is really required in your lease. I mean, you have to have basic terms like what's the length of the lease term and what's the rent going to be, but a lot of the expansion options, termination options, that's just sort of extra that you can negotiate on your own.
And the last question I have, on the contact option to give back space, the subleasing part. Is that subleasing you could do while you are in operation? You just subleasing part of the space?
Yeah.
You can do that as well.
Yeah. Now, there may be some physical restrictions to that as far as,
Right.
you know, shared reception and those kinds of things, but yeah, you can still operate in there.
How much you charge for a leasing review? I mean, I imagine that's part of your.
We do get asked that quite a bit. Our firm, we charge on hourly rates.
Okay.
It can sort of depend on. The answer is it depends, but you know our rates currently are, I think associate is about $225 an hour, and I think that goes up to about just shy of $400 an hour. And you know there are all types of different leases, so we'll see a landlord. The landlord may provide the lease form. That's usually what you'll see. As a startup, is the landlord has their form that they use for every other, you know, tenant in the center or whatever it is. You know, that lease could be 15 pages long, or it could be 60 pages long. It can be 12-point font, or it can be 8-point font. So it's, you know, when you start out talking about hourly rates and those kind of things, you kind of want to see the lease before you can give sort of a better quote or an idea of what that would be. But,
You guys don't prepare the lease
no, we prepare leases also.
as well.
Yeah, we would do that. And that's usually our preference, is that we generate the lease form. Usually that is cheaper because we're not, assuming the landlord, you know, is okay with you providing the lease, we're familiar with the form that we're comfortable with for that particular, you know, whether it's a single tenant building or a multi-tenant building. We would be able to customize it for that particular scenario. But also, hopefully, if you know, the form that the landlord agrees to would be, you know, that might cut down on a lot of the back and forth. Otherwise, if we get a lease and it's just way too landlord friendly, you know, that's a lot of time talking with you about, I have a list of 40 things here of why, you know, I think we need to try and negotiate some changes here.
So basically, we just meet with you, we tell you what I want, you write it down.
Mhm.
Landlord signs it with a witness, is binding contract, end story, right?
Right.
It's not bad.
Yeah, so, you know,
It's not bad.
we want to talk to you, figure out what your expectations are, what the basic deal terms are. You know, prepare a lease based on that, and then there's always, I say always, but 99% of the time, there's obviously some negotiation in the lease. That can go 1 or 2 rounds, or it can go, you know, 20 rounds back and forth with the landlord. It just depends on.
After being signed? Oh, well.
Before being signed.
Right after being signed.
After being signed, now, then you get calls and people want to amend the lease.
Right.
And, you know, those, usually the time on that is less, usually, but yeah, you can, you know, I think that from a startup standpoint, and it's admittedly self-serving from our standpoint too, but we do get calls, how much is it gonna cost? You know, people want like a flat rate for it, and sometimes that's appropriate, but I would look at it more in the context of what am I gonna be paying if I'm signing a 5-year lease. What's the total amount of investment I'm gonna have into the lease over 5 years? With the annual increases, with the sales tax, you know, all that stuff that you're paying with the build out. And then, you know, when an attorney tells you, well, it may cost you, you know, anywhere from $2,500 to $5,000 to get you, you know, get you to a point with the lease that it's ready to be signed. I would just look at that number in context to what the investment is in the overall space.
Gotcha. Well, hopefully I can bring you some people that want to do business here for Myers, and myself included, because it's kind of difficult. I even contemplated buying property that is commercial and residential at the same time. Which Mandela has all that here and there, but it's difficult, you know, so this helped me a lot. Thank you.
Okay, sure. I have, you know, if you want a copy of this, also I can email it to you.
Oh, really?
Presentation.
Oh, that would be great, yeah.
I don't know if you have a card, or I can give you my card and you can email me.
Yeah, I emailed it to you, I'm sorry, I was
Okay. No, it's okay.
left in a hurry by car.
Any questions on your end, or?
No, looks good.
Okay.
Nice. Well, thanks for letting me in.
Yeah, sure.
Gotta get back to the office.
Good to meet
It's
you.
good to meet you too.
Good luck to you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's going pretty well.
That's good. Yeah, you're with a good firm, so.
It's good to hear. It's
Yeah.
good to hear. Take care.
You're here for Myers, right?
Yes, yeah, our office is down on Rose Street, right by the courthouse here,
Oh, okay.
a couple blocks away. We have one in